Hello, and welcome to the solder how-to video. As you can see here, we have our basic solder equipment. We have a soldering iron resting in a soldering stand with a sponge that we will need to wet before we can begin, and some solder wire. Before you begin soldering, it's important to prep the tip by dabbing a little bit of solder on it. After you've done that, just wipe it off into your sponge, and that will help ensure the tip will last longer and prevent it from oxidizing as easily. Now that the soldering iron is ready, we can get the board ready to solder. It's important to be soldering on a flat surface area and to put all the pins in place ahead of time. That way, with a little bit of pressure in the middle of the board, we can make sure that none of the pins move around. Now that we have our pins prepped and ready to be soldered, it's important that we solder the outside pin on each set first. That way, after we've got all the sets of pins tacked in place, we can flip the board over and verify that all of our pins are still straight. And if they aren't, we can just press the soldering iron against the base of the pins that need to be corrected, and it'll loosen up enough that we can just kind of lean it to the side a bit. Otherwise, if you solder them all in place, realigning the pins might be a lot more difficult. To do the actual soldering, just press the soldering iron against the pin and hold it there for a few seconds. Then press the solder up against the solder iron. And then you should see a nice little bubble of solder kind of melt into place. Then after you do that pin, we can move on to the other outside pin and solder that one in place as well. We're going to continue on like this and move on to the next set of pins. So all you gotta do is set the soldering iron against the pin, hold it there for about 2 seconds, and then just touch it with the solder. Don't worry if you miss the pin or get solder on the soldering iron. You can just wipe that off when it bunches up. Or, as I did, I just kind of flipped it over and pressed it in place. And then, after you're done with those first 2 sets, I just grabbed it and flipped it over just to kind of verify that it was straight. I noticed that one set of pins was a little crooked, but not enough to where it won't be able to just press into place in the Uno. And once I was done with those 2 outer sets, I flipped the board around and went ahead and soldered the other sets in place. Now, you'll notice here that I'm not too worried about getting solder on the actual board itself, because the board's covered in a solder mask. That means that I could touch it with the soldering iron and it's not going to burn it. Another neat thing about the solder mask is solder itself won't stick to it. So you don't have to worry about getting too much solder on it, because it will all just bead up onto the pin. Which brings me to this next pin. If you get too much solder on a pin, don't worry about it. You could use a little bit of solder flux afterwards to get rid of it. Or just kind of wipe your solder iron against the pin, then wipe it on the sponge, bring the solder iron back, and just try to pick it off a little bit that way. But it's not the end of the world if you get too much solder on a pin. And a little bit of extra solder won't prevent it from sitting in all the way. It's not going to sit flush with the set of pins anyways. The main reason why I ended up with too much solder on that pin was because I tried to put the solder on before the pin got too hot, and so the solder wasn't really sticking very well to the pin, and when I put more solder on, it just overwhelmed it. Again, if you end up with too much solder, it's not that big of a deal. You can just reheat the pin and the solder should just melt down. I probably should have spent a little bit more time on that one pin instead of just instantly going to throw more solder onto it. Another thing to keep in mind is while you're soldering, give yourself a lot of slack on the solder itself. That way you never get caught tugging on it, and you're able to just solely focus on the pin you're trying to solder or the one component you're trying to solder. You're not trying to sit there and work around all your solder wire and accidentally moving your board around.
Once we verify that all of our pins are straight or as straight as they're going to be, then we're going to flip back over and we're just going to go through and solder each pin one at a time. This part goes by a little quicker. So you just kind of touch the pin, drip the solder down, lift away. Touch the pin, drip the solder down, and lift away. Touch the pin, drip the solder down. If it will actually go down. There we go. Touch the pin, drip the solder, touch the pin, drip the solder, touch the pin. I'm not touching the pin. Touch the pin. Drip the solder. Touch the pin. Drip the solder. And again, you want to hold it for about 2-3 seconds and then touch it with solder. If the solder isn't taking right away, it means you're not actually heating the pin up enough, because it should just flow right on. So you want to make sure you have a nice firm contact with the pin. That way it just flows right into place. So you get a nice firm contact with the pin, and it should just flow right on. And you're going to do that for all the rest of the pins.
You might have noticed that the second set of pins that I was soldering barely got any solder on it. But you don't need to worry about that. All you have to do is go back through with your soldering iron, touch it to the pin. You'll see the solder kind of glow a little bit as it gets hot. It's going to get a little glossy, and that's when you know you can apply more solder. And you're just going to go through and do that for any pin that you feel didn't really get enough solder on. And you'll be able to tell just by looking to see, do you have a nice smooth bevel around the whole pin? If you don't, maybe you can put a little bit more solder on, or just touch the solder iron to it and let it heat up enough to where all the solder could kind of settle into place. And that's it for your soldering tutorial.